We're really, really excited to have you here, Jamie. And I'll talk a little bit just for a minute before we go. I know you have a fixed window and a lot of very important business, but the Wirewheel Spokes Conference has been really a free and open gathering for a pretty broad community. We've included policymakers, activists, human rights focused, regulators in Europe, regulators in the US. And the whole focus of our gathering here was to bring the best learnings and the best sharings that we can on areas that affect people around their information. And so we started our first session, and I'm gonna, again, pause and until the room is filled. But we started our first sessions with the leading regulators on information who worry about human rights every day in Europe, coming to our community and saying, we understand that a lot of the world has really been shut down by COVID, but they were telling our community, you should know, we in Europe, we believe in human rights. We believe this to be a fundamental part of the way we live. And we're not stopping watching out for that, even in the midst of COVID shutdowns. That was the message you heard. And over the last couple of days, we've had an incredible group of folks who've donated their time to the community to come in and talk about fundamental human rights, how to keep a focus on civil rights and diversity in our community, and to continue to promote human rights and civil rights, and to watch for our companies who are often trying to do the right thing, even in the face of enormous financial pressure. The COVID shutdowns have put a lot of pressure on folks losing their jobs, losing budgets, Jamie, at the moment. So, because we have a short window, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce you to talk to this community. I've known you for a very long time. I could not be more proud of what you say and how you represent your district and a lot of the voices who can't be heard in Congress around the areas of civil rights, human rights, and you're such an eloquent voice for so many of us. So, having known you so long, I know you know how proud we are of you. But Jamie, welcome to Spokes. And if you don't mind, the major question we wanted to ask you today is, you've been out talking about police reform and civil rights even at this time. I'll turn it over to you to talk about how do we keep a focus on these critical issues, even at the time of enormous crisis.
Justin, thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you for having me. And whatever pride you feel in me cannot approximate the pride I feel in you as my student and all of the remarkable work that you've done as a lawyer. And I'm very proud of everything you're doing with Wirewheel. And this conference is just an exemplary intervention in the course of events. So thank you for organizing it and putting it together and bringing forth all of these great speakers and ideas on such a critical subject. I view this moment of profound crisis. The mega crisis is climate change. Then COVID-19 is the crisis within the crisis. Then we've got the economic crisis within the public health crisis and the unemployment crisis. So we've got crises within crises. And so I think that everybody recognizes it's a moment of dramatic danger and also dramatic opportunity. Things can fall apart very quickly, and we can revert to barbaric impulses and the destruction of human rights and civil liberties and the rule of law and the social contract, or we can rebuild. We can use this moment to make things stronger, because this crisis has exposed a lot of underlying deficiencies in our social contract, in the way we're working, or as I keep seeing the phrase, it has laid bare a lot of the racial inequalities, a lot of the economic inequalities, a lot of the injustices in our society. And for me, as a professor of constitutional law, it's an illuminating moment, because all of government, all of civil government is based on the idea of a social contract. And the whole idea of the social contract is we'll be safer, we'll be more secure, we'll be more prosperous inside the social contract than outside of it, which Thomas Hobbes told us is a state of nature, a state of war, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, right? It's a war of all against all. So we bargain on the inside. But we've had this remarkable and I'd say breathtaking, amazing explosion of protest by young Americans all across the country, pointing out that the social contract is not working for the African American community. And we can't get to any of the other problems until we deal with this basic flaw in the social contract, which of course goes back to the beginning, because racism and white supremacy, violent white supremacy, were the original sin of America. And you know, our great Supreme Court, whose decision today we cheered, sits on land that was used for slave trafficking and on what used to be a prison. And for the first century of the country, the Supreme Court did nothing for enslaved African Americans other than to say in the Dred Scott decision in 1857 that the slaves and the descendants of slaves have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And Dred Scott could not bring a federal lawsuit for his freedom, although he'd been brought into free territory. He could not bring the suit in federal court, you'll recall, Justin, because the diversity, he could not qualify under the diversity jurisdiction clause because he was not a citizen, and he could not be a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution because he was not a white man. Well, that was the Supreme Court all the way up until the Civil War and until Reconstruction. So our first chance to get through this was with the Civil War, which Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address gave us a new birth of freedom in the country, and the Reconstruction, where there was this effort to transfer land and resources, political power, voting rights, public offices to the African American community so we could have a real multiracial democracy. And it lasted for 12 years before it was dismantled by violent white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan and the Night Riders, and then the grandfather tests and the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the white primaries. And that reinstated a system of political white supremacy. Slavery by another name. Wall Street Journal reporter Douglas Blackman called it in his bestseller of that name. Slavery by another name for a century between Reconstruction and this modern civil rights movement. And then we had a second Reconstruction through the blood sacrifice of Dr. King and Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and SNCC and the people who fought for voting rights, blood, sweat, and tears, and gave us the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. And that gave us a new opportunity, but that too has been rolled back with Supreme Court decisions and with politicians who see fascists and racists marching in the streets of Charlottesville and say that there's good people on both sides. And so we've got a chance now because of what the young people have produced in the middle of all of these overlapping, intersecting crises. In the middle of all of that, the young people went out with their masks on, trying to maintain as much social distancing as they could to confront the reality of police brutality and official racism that was exposed by the George Floyd killing and the Breonna Taylor killing and on and on and on. And they basically came to say the social contract is not working for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and millions of African Americans who pay the salaries of police officers and who are governed like everybody else, but are too often confronting a police force that is like an occupying army rather than their own guardians, which is really what police should be. So we've got a chance with this bill that we passed out of our Judiciary Committee last night. We were in for 11 hours considering all the different kinds of amendments, but we passed a bill which bans racial, ethnic, and religious profiling. It bans strangleholds and chokeholds. It bans the corrupt and perverse doctrine of qualified immunity, which allows bad cops to escape liability in court. It creates a federal database for police misconduct, so an officer is not dismissed in one place for crimes against citizenry and then resurface someplace else. There's a lot of great stuff in there, and unfortunately, it was along party lines, but at least all the Democrats voted for it, and so we've got an historic opportunity, I think, to amend and strengthen the social contract in that sense. And I state this because I think it's emblematic of what we can be doing across the board. One of the silver linings of this very dark period is that people are at home. People can engage in things like this, not just at a local level, but at a national or global level. And people can have conversations about what are the basic terms of our social contract. And I know that a lot of people that are active with you at this conference and with Wirewheel are people very interested in the question of privacy and people's rights in their own data, and the government not manipulating information and expropriating information from private companies and from individuals and so on. That is a perfect example of what needs to be reconceptualized and renegotiated in terms of redefining the social contract of the extraordinary times that we're living in.
Yeah, and Jamie, I couldn't agree with you more. I'd love for you to talk about the bill and where you see this going, given everything that's going on. But it also must be so strange to be in this world right now, to try to make progress on these critical civil rights issues. There's human rights issues, and every day there's another thing in the newspaper, I assume you don't actually get a newspaper anymore, but there's another thing that you cannot believe coming out of the White House or elsewhere that just makes you stand back. It's like one thing after another. So, when you see the note, the note out of John Bolton's book about Xi Jinping and President Trump, and you see those things, you see COVID, you see, the major financial meltdowns. How do you move something forward like police reform or these human rights issues? How do you keep your eye on the ball with these? It's like whack-a-mole, like by 10,
Yeah. That's a pretty accurate description of my world. I will say that I've been cheered by the extraordinary activism of new generations of young people on a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic basis. And I'm cheered by the democratic response to so much authoritarianism all over the world, whether we're talking about Putin in Russia or Orban in Hungary or, El-Sisi in Egypt or Duterte in the Philippines or, President Xi in China. Whatever it is, people have a life instinct for democracy, which means human rights and human dignity at the core, and then promoting the values that will protect large numbers of people, not people capturing government as a private business venture and then putting it to their own uses. That's the model of corruption that is spread all over the world. And I think democracy is the answer to it. And the spread of information, good information, accurate and truthful information, against propaganda and disinformation is the weapon and the tool of democracy. But we're in a real struggle. There is no doubt. We are in a serious, serious struggle here for everything that we believe in. Everything is on the line right now. And I'm hopeful that the House, and I'm pretty confident the House will pass this legislation next week on Thursday or Friday, along with some other legislation that's close to my heart, statehood for people in Washington, D.C., who remain the only residents of a nation's capital on earth who are not represented in their own parliament, which is a pretty remarkable thing, but we hope we'll begin to move that in the right direction next week too. So I think that we just have to use all of these mechanisms to advance democratic agendas. I think a lot of the progressive civil rights, civil liberties movements looked at what happened in 2016, and they saw the way in which the new technologies could be corrupted and put to use by authoritarians like Vladimir Putin, with the bots and the trolling and the subversion and the cyber attacks and the espionage and so on. And we've got to turn that around and try to make all of these things instruments of democracy and justice. And people are not stupid. People, I think, are waking up to what's been taking place. But still, it's going to be, I think, a profound struggle across the board on all of these different issues.
No, I agree with you, and I can imagine keeping your eye on that ball now is going to be tough. And one thing that came up regularly in our discussions is you have companies and organizations all around the world right now that are trying to think about how do we reopen. And you think about this idea of people coming back together. Jamie, you've seen it at the marches, but imagine a company opening back up. They're often trying to figure out let's assume that when you open back up, you're going to get people coming into contact and folks are going to have an illness. Well, you don't want, from a human rights perspective, if you assume that privacy is a human right. And by the way, around the world, that's true. In the US, it's not, it's one of these things that we have to debate a bit.
Yeah.
But assuming that you view privacy as a human right, you worry about people just emailing around or sharing healthcare information. This is part of the thing this community is struggling with. And I heard in panel after panel over the last few days, a fair amount of worry that as companies are collecting information for the right reason, just to make sure they can help each other, that information won't be treated improperly by government authorities, when companies are trying to do the right thing. So, I assume with everything you've been doing on the front around police reform, you might not have had time to see some of the things that are coming up around the COVID bills, but that part of it, in other words, giving some ability for companies to do the right thing and understand the rules when it comes to holding the data and then discarding that kind of data as soon as the crisis is over is a critical thing for this community.
Well, I'm delighted that you're working on it. I've not had any time to look into that, but I hope to. I assume there's legislation being examined by the Education and Labor Committee, or maybe it's Energy and Commerce. I don't know exactly who's checking it out on the House side, but that's critical question. Obviously, one of the things I have been working on, because I'm on the Coronavirus Response Committee, the Clyburn Committee, is getting OSHA to move on developing workplace standards so offices and companies and businesses understand what the government is saying needs to be done in terms of safe reopening. We haven't seen anything about it. We're just in this catch as catch can, ragtag, helter-skelter universe where everybody's doing their own thing. And that's risky from a whole bunch of different perspectives, including, the health perspective, the legal perspective, the durability of reopening, and so on. So we want to try to get real public health advice rendered, and we want to get OSHA to establish an emergency rule that's in our HEROES Act, defining exactly what are the rules for different kinds of workplaces, from meat packing to movie theaters to the traditional office space. Do there need to be dividers? What is the proper distancing? What are the proper masking policies, temperature taking, and then what privacy policies go along with it? These are really important issues that have just been punted. It is not a strategy for victory in the coronavirus crisis to pretend like that's not an issue, just like it's not a strategy for victory to not develop a nationwide plan for testing, contact tracing, and other public health protocols. But it's like we've been thrust back to the Articles of Confederation. Like, the federal government is not a real actor in terms of coordinating the actions of the states and helping the states through it. It's just a war of all against all among the states, just to try to get the PPPs that they need, the ventilators that they need. We should not be putting them in these bidding wars against each other.
Yeah, and we heard a lot about that from our community, and it is frustrating, right? If you're trying to do the right thing to understand what the rules are. Jamie, I know that you have a lot of things on your plate and that you have a pretty fixed schedule. I guess if we could have a minute more from you just on this last point, which is, if our focus here today was how to keep these important human rights, and civil rights on the agenda and how to move these things forward, and you're in the middle of trying to move, some of these civil rights legislation and other issues forward, there's so many tough things we're all facing. And we heard emotionally from a number of members of our community how much of a struggle it's been personally, right? I don't know that I can empathize, even though we've all had our issues. I can't really empathize with what so many folks are facing. Give us a little hope here. Do you see a path for making progress? Or maybe I should say, don't give us hope, give it to us straight. Do you feel like we can make progress on some of these human rights, civil rights issues? And do you feel like we can move the agenda forward over the next couple of years?
Well, I definitely do. I feel tremendous optimism. Who would have thought that we would have a mass human rights movement erupt in the middle of a plague with hundreds of thousands of people on the streets? Now, the dark side of it, of course, is that there's been this terrible response from the government. I mean, President Trump and Attorney General Barr unleashed essentially a secret paramilitary force with federal officers with no identification on them on crowds of peaceful protesters to clear Farragut Square. And they used tear gas, they used pepper spray against my constituents, they used rubber bullets to clear paths so the president could cross the street and conduct his triumphant photo opportunity, maybe the worst photo op of American history, where he took someone else's Bible, turned it upside down, and waved it over his head. When I tweeted out when it first happened that he violated the First Amendment so he could cross the street and violate the First Commandment by making himself an idol above the Lord of the Bible. So there's progress, and then there's reaction against progress. And so we're in a struggle. But because of the plague, I think people have in mind that we're experiencing this universal misfortune altogether. And one thing that does is it concentrates your mind on the difference between misfortune and injustice, because nobody can really do anything about a plague. That just happens. That nobody no human being's responsible for that. That just happens, like the flu pandemic of 1918. But if you can't get health care, if you can't get tested, and certain classes of people can get tested or have doctors following them around with tests, if you have no access to means of getting through the crisis, while other people have all the means, that's not just a misfortune, that's an injustice, because we can do something about that. So the existence of the plague focuses our minds on the things that we can control. We can make our society far more just, far more fair, far more humane for everybody. And I think it will happen. I don't know if you've had a chance, Justin, to reread Camus' The Plague during this time, but it makes for fascinating reading. And there's a passage in there which really jumped out at me, where the hero says that that this may sound funny to some people, it might make them laugh, but there's no talk of heroism during this process. The only way to get through a plague is with common decency. And I really believe that. I mean, you can become a hero just by being decent, just by showing decency to other people and trying to figure out what they would want to do. And I guess that takes me back to the social contract, the original position. We've got to imagine what it would be like to be in somebody else's shoes. You got to imagine that it's you or someone in your family who has the cop's knee on your neck, or whose bedroom has been invaded by a SWAT team. Like, you've got to imagine that's you. And do you want your social contract to allow that? You got to imagine what it would be like to be somebody else. And I think this moment gives us the opportunity to rethink everything. What really is the decent thing to do? What is the fair and reasonable thing to do during this process? So thanks for having me join your conversation, Justin, and thanks for all the magnificent stuff you're doing.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks. And I know you have to run. I'm just going to say thank you for coming, and I know you have to drop. It's been a terrific couple of days. Jamie, thank you.
Best to you.
Best. And for everybody else that joined us here at Spokes over the last few days, I really want to thank you for committing some time and all of the energy to what has been just a really wonderful couple of days with our community. Our team at Wirewheel has invested a lot to make sure that this was a great experience for everybody who could join. And I want to recognize the entire team, of course, driven by our marketing team, Konstantin Kittrick, Ehrlich, and Emily, and Sarah, and Mark, our entire team who really have committed so much time to making sure this was a wonderful event for everybody over these last couple of days. I do hope that you will stay engaged with us. We're going to plan, obviously, for this community to join us again for Spokes 2021. And hopefully we'll be able to see everybody in person. But we're going to look for more opportunities that we can bring advice and guidance and really deep expertise, as we did over these last few days, to the whole community for people to be able to collaborate in this way. So I want to thank everybody for your time. I really look forward to seeing you again. We tried to do our best to make sure you could have some space to actually see each other and communicate and have a cocktail or a coffee virtually. My real hope is in the coming years, we'll be able to have Spokes in person to see each other and to learn a lot more. So on behalf of the entire Wirewheel team, thank you for joining us at Spokes 2020, and we'll see you in the coming years.